Don't listen in the dark. Fair Scare.
The top story of the night, 2 unidentified men have succeeded in one of the most daring bank robberies in New York State history, taking over $2 million in cash during a poorly timed armored car transition in the small rural town of Tomaston. Police suspect one or more of the men involved may have had a job with the bank, as knowledge of the location and timing of their money transports were extremely proprietary. Roadblocks have been set up throughout the major highways and state routes across New York State. The suspects were last seen headed toward Pennsylvania as they fled the scene. Police say they will apprehend the men within 24 hours. More information as it is made available.
Robbie leaned over and turned off the radio. Mitchell sat next to him in the car. The silence was almost loud. The road was pitch black, every curve came as a surprise. As they drove along, Mitchell could feel his stomach tightening into many, many knots. Robbie, on the other hand, wasn't nervous at all. They had simply walked up to the truck with their guns out and took the money. It would have been perfect if one of the guards hadn't tried to be a hero, but what does one $10 an hour rent-a-cop really matter when there's $2 million to gain? Not much as far as he was concerned. Mitchell wasn't quite so comfortable with their actions, but he was fine with the payout. $1 million each, and the cops are looking for them in Pennsylvania. Mitchell couldn't help but chuckle to himself about that as they crossed the Connecticut state line. The two of them had been friends for years. Robbie was a bit older and had spent his early 20s in state prison for grand theft auto. Mitchell met him on the outside, and while he would often be a moral man, the promise of quick risk and huge reward kept him on board with Robbie's schemes. Stealing from vending machines and parking meters was a great way to afford a flat-screen TV or an iPod here and there, but this heist took the cake. For weeks, Robbie would drive out to Tomaston, sit in his car and watch the transaction go down between the armored trucks. Tomaston was a tiny, sleepy town basically no one had ever heard of. Robbie wouldn't have even known about it either, but then his great-aunt died, and he went to the funeral. That was when he laid eyes on one of the easiest scores there could ever be. As they drove down the dark back roads of Connecticut, the car felt heavy, with the weight of their actions as well as the weight of the $2 million in cash. The safe house they were headed to had been provided by Ava, Mitchell's girlfriend. The house belonged to her ex-stepmother. No one lived there most of the year, and while Robbie was never comfortable with involving a woman in their plans, it was the best option. The arrangement was simple. Robbie and Mitchell split it 50-50, then they parted ways. Robbie planned on heading to South America to expand his criminal horizons, and Mitchell planned on heading off to Europe. He thought it was romantic. The road winded and slowly turned from paved to dirt. The moon was half full and the blue light shined off of a stream they seemed to be following. The car pulled up to a dark house, and as they got out, a woman walked out of the pitch black. The glow of her cigarette gave her face an amber glow as she puffed away. Ava had been nervously chain-smoking and listening to the radio for hours. She ditched her cigarette and ran up to Mitchell. She held him tight and told him how glad she was to know he was all right. Robbie just looked on with a face that could only be described as skeptical. "Hello, Robbie," Ava said begrudgingly. "We made it," he said short and proud. As they went inside, it became apparent that the house no longer had power. It would appear the house had gone from an occasional country getaway to fully abandoned in the last few years. Ava fumbled off into the dark and returned with 2 old gas lanterns. Primitive, but effective. Robbie stretched his legs and propped down on a recliner chair. Ava and Mitchell almost immediately retired to the kitchen, no doubt to put a wall between themselves and Robbie. He could faintly hear their voices. Ava always took the aggressive tone, and Mitchell always collapsed to her demands. Robbie didn't know what they were talking about, and he really didn't care. He was just counting money in his head, over and over and over. When they entered the living room again, Ava was silent and nudging Mitchell. He clearly had no desire to say whatever she had coerced him into. Finally, she pushed him aside and jumped to the point. "I wanted to talk about my half." "Your half," Robbie said. "You don't have a half. You two can figure out what you do with your money on your own time. Ava didn't like his answer, and she had no qualms with explaining that she had found the getaway house, and she had kept her mouth shut. She wanted a third for her trouble. Robbie was in shock. He was fuming mad, but he knew that the answer was to wait. He always knew it was better to think and then act. Mitchell and Ava retired to a bedroom in the back of the house. Robbie was sitting watch under the flickering light of a single candle. No one had asked him to do it, but he felt obligated to watch for anything unusual. His head was still buzzing with rage over Ava's demands, but he still hadn't decided how to deal with it. A sound boomed through the house. Robbie nearly jumped out of his skin. He pulled out his gun and then immediately realized it was the bedroom door opening. The dark hallway filled with amber light as Mitchell stumbled through the hallway with his lantern burning off the last bit of fuel it had. "What the hell are you doing?" Robbie whispered. "I'm thirsty," Mitchell replied, groggy and innocent. At that moment, Robbie's mind fired up a story. Robbie took Mitchell aside and quietly explained the situation as he saw it, explaining that earlier in the evening, Ava had come to him and flat out told him if she didn't get her cut, she would go to the police. This shocked Mitchell. It was a sobering realization for him. He was upset, but he knew where this was going. It would all be very simple. They walked back into the bedroom as quiet as they could. Mitchell was solemn, and even Robbie couldn't maintain his usual professional composure. He reached for the pillow next to Ava's head and slowly picked it up. She shifted in her sleep, which nearly made Robbie cry out. He brought the pillow back and prepared himself for the task. He began to slowly bring the pillow toward her face. Mitchell's hand stopped Robbie, and at that moment Robbie was ready to do them both in. But when they made eye contact, it became clear. Mitchell wanted to do the deed himself. As Mitchell brought the pillow down over Ava's face, she began to panic. Robbie kept yelling at him to push harder. The time it took to smother the life out of Ava felt like an eternity. She scratched, she clawed, as her muffled screams and cries were growing louder and louder. Robbie leaned in and put his weight on the pillow to aid Mitchell's effort. And that was all it took. Her body went limp. Mitchell started to let off, but Robbie snapped at him and told him to hold it down for another minute. They had to be sure. They rolled her up in the bedding she had laid in and walked her outside carefully. The easiest option was to put her in the nearby stream. The 50-foot walk went by quickly as both the men tried to count the money in their heads over and over again to ignore the ghastly act that they were committing. They walked back to the house in silence. Mitchell laid back down in bed and tried in vain to sleep. Robbie was a crook and a killer, but this was brutal even for him. He decided to go outside and walk, get fresh air, and think about his money. The air was cool and moist with dew, silent and still, but then the sound of the water started to infiltrate the night. Trudging feet walked out of the water, covered in moss and mud, making their way toward the house. Coming to correct a wrong, coming for revenge, coming for Mitchell. A slimy seaweed-covered hand started to open the front door. Mitchell jumped awake in his bed, his heart pounding and his body covered in perspiration. His panic wasn't calming much at all when he suddenly realized he heard that sound again. Those trudging footsteps. But they were real to him this time. He knew they couldn't be, though. They were from his dream and from his guilty conscience. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then a pounding came to the door. This was real. The pounding was real. Ava had come back to punish him. He killed the woman he loved. Something like that couldn't go unpunished. Mitchell went to his nightstand. He had a pistol Robbie had given him for insurance during the heist. He grabbed it and he ran to the living room. The pounding had gotten louder. He pointed the gun at the door. "You're dead! You aren't coming back! I got the money and you're dead!" He screamed frantically. He fired into the door. Just then, he heard a groan. The sound of pain. Mitchell's mind finally switched back to reality. He ran up and opened the door. Robbie laid there, with bullets in his stomach and chest. Mitchell got down on his knees and checked him out. But he was dead. You can't be dead. Oh man, I'm so sorry, buddy. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Mitchell knew he couldn't live with himself now. He'd killed the woman he loved and his best friend. He knew there was one bullet left, and he knew exactly how to use it. He put the gun in his mouth and cocked the hammer back. This was it. He cringed as he prepared to pull the trigger. Suddenly, a thought went through his mind. The money! He didn't have to split it with anyone now. $2 million was all his! Maybe life was worth living after all. As he started to remove the gun from his mouth, a slimy hand came out of the darkness covered in seaweed and moss. It grabbed his hand, and it pulled the trigger.
I love you, Mitchell.